It's time for us to check back in with Alex Stewart and see what happens next. If you've missed any of the previous readings, just look in the description below for a playlist. We've talked a lot about your herb doctrine, but you didn't do any surgery, did you? How was it possible to perform operations with no hospitals? I didn't have the right kind of tools to operate, but I've seen it done. I was up here on the ridge working with a feller, Sexton was his name, and he got his arm broke so bad that they had to take it off. He was a big, square-shouldered feller, and I guess he weighed over 200 pounds. Old Dr. Mitchell come up there and took that arm off. Just give him a little morphine tablet. It was pitiful to see him lying there with one hand and the other laying over there beside him on the table. What happened if someone broke a limb and Dr. Mitchell was at the far end of the county? There was an old feller up there by the name of Lee Burchett, and he followed that. If you got your leg broke, why, he'd come down and make some splints, to put around it and tie it up. He'd go to the woods and dig some roots that he'd boil down and make a poultice to bathe your leg or whatever you broke to take the swelling out. Lou Trent was a good hand at setting bones. He'd go far and near to anybody that got their arm or leg broke. He'd bind them up and put splinters on and wrap it tight, but not so tight that it would cut off the circulation. He was a good stock doctor, too. He was gifted at it. I suppose the fights and the shootings that you've told me about created the need for a good deal of doctrine and medical attention. Oh, Lord, it was awful. Every week, not just once in a while, somebody would get shot or cut all to pieces. They was a Collins feller that lived on the ridge, and they laid him open with a butcher knife, and his guts just dropped out. They was two boys come along, a Williams boy and a boy named Ardell Collins, and they took and washed the dirt off his insides and stuffed them back. Then they took his shirt and bound him up and took him to old lady Levacy, who was sort of a doctor. She dabbed him up and put some stitches in him, and he got well. Now, Pap's uncle, Bert Goins, he got shot right square through the bow. It missed his backbone by 1/2 inch and just happened not to have hit any of his entrails. How did this come about? They's having a big party right out here on the ridge, fighting chickens, making music, and drinking liquor. Uncle Bert was laying there by the fire, and Ed Anderson come up and shot a hole through him with a .45 caliber cap and ball pistol. They went and got Dr. Curry. He lived up towards Kyle's Ford. Well, somebody there had one of them silk handkerchiefs, and old Dr. Curry, he twisted it up, tied a little switch on the end of it, put some medicine on the handkerchief, and pulled it clear through Uncle Bert. Pulled it out the other side, and the old Scudder got well. What happened to Ed Anderson, the man who shot your Uncle Bert? It took Uncle Bert 4 or 5 months before he could get up and go. He said he'd kill that SOB if he ever laid eyes on him. He got him a big pistol and carried it looking for Anderson. He lived right over here on Blackwater, and when he heard that Uncle Bert was up and about looking to kill him, he left the country and went to Indiana. I never did hear from him no more. When Alex finished the story about his great-uncle's intent to kill the man who had shot him, he sat silently for several moments. He picked up the half-used twist of the bull-faced tobacco, and with his pocket knife started shaving off thin layers to fill his pipe. He tamped it gently into the bowl with his gnarled index finger, and as he did so, he gazed out the window, never looking at his pipe. He didn't need to. He had done it 10,000 times before, and I was convinced he could have done it just as well in total darkness. Finally, he had just the right amount of tobacco, and he reached into his overalls for his matches. It was at this point that I asked Alex if he ever carried a pistol. It was an idle question, and I was not prepared for Alex's rather dramatic answer. Yeah, I carried one a little over 3 years to kill a feller with. I carried it under my shirt, right there, and just as sure as my breeches went on of a morning, that gun went on. It was a .38 special, 6 inches in the barrel. Who was the fellow, and what had he done? His name was Lode Williams. He was a hateful, overbearing feller, not fit for nothing. He catched me gone and come up to my house one day, drinking and raising Cain, and slapped Margie and the kids around. She finally grabbed the shotgun and shot at him. He jumped behind a tree just as she shot, and she knocked the bark right off where his head had been. When I come home, they told me about it, and I said, I'll kill that SOB if it's the last thing I do. Well, his grandpap was a pretty good old man, and he went and told Lode that I was out to kill him, and Lode stayed away from me. Every time I saw him, he was in a crowd, and I couldn't get a chance at him. We sold a feller 12 or 15 turkeys up here at Kyle's Ford for a shooting match one time, and we drove them up there. I guess there was 75 people there when we got there, and Lode was amongst them. He seed me, and the first thing I knowed, he was gone. He knowed I meant business, and he shunned me every chance he got. I would have killed him just as sure as I'm sitting here if I had ever found the chance. But I got to studying about it, and I thought that nobody got hurt, nobody damaged, and to kill him would be on my mind on and on. I said, I'll just let it go. And I took my gun off and hung it on the wall. There was a print of that gun in my side where I'd carried it so long. He's the only feller that I ever got into my mind to hurt, and now I'm proud that I didn't get a chance to do it. It may be difficult for some to understand how a man as kind, compassionate, and gentle as Alex could want to kill another human. To understand the answer to this question, one has to understand the historic background of Alex and his kin. Horace Capar, in his book, Our Southern Highlanders, addresses the question of violence in mountain communities. He points out, for example, that the homicide rate in an area of western North Carolina where he was living at the time was about 1 in 1,000. The national rate at that time was 1 in 16,000, the rate in Italy was 1 in 66,000, and the rate in Germany was only 1 in 200,000. Why was the murder rate 200 times greater among my Appalachian friends than among the Germans? Without pretending to have a complete and definite answer to these perplexing statistics, the following suggestions are offered. First, the pioneers of this rugged and inhospitable land tended to be self-reliant, stout-hearted, and individualistic in nature. Perhaps more importantly, they had to refine these qualities once they took their place in the wilderness in order to survive. As Capart pointed out, their independence grew more haughty and their individualism more intense. In their isolation, there was little specialization of labor as compared to the old countries, and even compared to the more populated eastern sections of this country. There were no carpenters, blacksmiths, tanners, etc. in most early and sparsely settled areas. A man then had to build his own furniture, do his own stonework, his own doctrine, blacksmithing, and otherwise provide for the needs of his family. He also, to a great extent, had to be responsible for his own law enforcement. Many of the counties in southern Appalachia were quite large, the roads poor, and bridges often lacking altogether. Law enforcement under such conditions was difficult. It sometimes took days just to summon the sheriff, and even if he determined the identity of a culprit, the chances of catching him were slim to none. So if justice was to be done, then the victim, or most often the head of the household, had to assume responsibility for it. In a land where there existed few social organizations and where there was little community interaction, family ties and family loyalty became stronger. Capart states that the weak social structure contributed to an undying devotion to family and kindred. Mountaineers everywhere, he stated, are passionately attached to their homes. He goes on to offer that their ties to kinship were greater than those of any other Americans he knew. Given these circumstances, it was Alex's duty to assume the responsibility for punishing someone who had encroached on his home and abused his family. He would have been a coward, less of a man, if he had not done so. At least that's the way Alex looked at it. You were talking earlier about all the knifings and shootings. Do you know any of the murder victims? Oh, I know about all of them. The one closest home, I guess, was little George Ball. His uncle killed him. How did this come about? It was in the fall, and I was fixing to make molasses. I looked up and seed Melvin Collins running down the road toward me, all excited and out of breath. I said, "What on earth's the matter?" He said, "I've seen the awfulest sight. Little George is laying down there below his house, dead. His Uncle George has killed him." Well, they wasn't allowed to move him till they had an inquest. They sent for old Doc Mitchell, and by the time he got there, I guess they's 30 or 40 people down there. Little George's face was covered up with fly eggs. That beat anything ever I seed. He'd been shot in the face, and you couldn't tell that he'd ever had one. Doc tried to get somebody to clean them fly blows out of his face so he could investigate, and he couldn't get anybody to do it. He said to me, "Take you a little stick and see if you can rake them off." I got down there with a stick trying to rake them, but it was just like raking mud. I said, "I can't do no good. I don't want to tear the hide off of him." Doc said, "They ain't but one way I know that you can get them off. If we had some whiskey to pour on them, that would get shed of them." I said, "We can get the whiskey, Doc." I sent Tim Gibson up to the house to get a quart of liquor. I was just about to vomit all over the place when Tim got back with the whiskey, and I turned that up and took me a sup of it. We used that quart of liquor on them fly blows, and that got them loose. Old Doc counted 12 shots around George's face and 20-some around his chest. He must have put every shot that shell had in him. Well, they made a coffin just as quick as they could and put him in it. His sister, one of them, lived over here about a mile the other side of me. She married Ross Sweeney. He had a team of mules and a sled. We put him on that sled to take and bury him back here on top of this point. He stunk so bad that Ross couldn't drive. I got a hold of the reins and drove them out there and helped put him away. Doc said, "I'll tell you, you got more nerve than airy man down here." I'll swear it seemed like I could smell that man for a month. What did old George have against his nephew, Little George? Well, now, Little George lived right here at the Virginia and Tennessee line, and he was bootlegging. He'd sell liquor in Virginia, so they couldn't get him over here in Tennessee. Old George was selling liquor too, and he took some up to Virginia to sell, and Little George didn't like his uncle coming over into his territory selling liquor, and they got into it. Little George got his uncle down and just beat him all to pieces. The old man got up, come home, got his shotgun, and went right back and killed Little George. He went to the penitentiary 10 years for it. He served 8 years and come back. See, old George was afraid of Little George, so he hid out and bushwhacked him. That's what it made it look bad, and that's why he got so much time. I've heard you talk of old George Ball before. He was a pretty good fellow, wasn't he? Oh, yeah, he was as nice a talking feller as you ever met. Yes, sir. He had 9 children at the time, and his wife was dead. He spent all his money on lawyers and going to court, and when they took him off, they had to sell his farm to pay his debts. His children moved off and built them a little house down here on the creek. I wish it was light enough, and I'd show you where they lived. There's just one of them children still living. Now, Little George was as mean as a black snake. He kept slipping around and stealing his daddy's liquor. Burley Ball was his daddy's name, and he lived right next to us. Well, Burley catched him at it, and they got into it, and Little George started to run, and his daddy put 6 holes in his hat. They said he was running after 2 or 3 women over on Blackwater, and his wife couldn't get him to stop. Stayed gone half the time. She was at the house when she heard the shot that killed him. They said Little George hollered, "Oh, Sally." That was his wife's name. She just turned and walked back in the house and said, "I guess you'll quit going to Blackwater now." She just let him lay there for 2 days until some of the neighbors found him. She never went to the burying. They had 2 pretty little girls, as pretty as you ever looked at. One went down to Knoxville and worked in a restaurant for years. She was a fine woman for the chances she had. Alex, you indicated that if George Ball had killed Little George in a fight, if he hadn't have bushwhacked him, he might not have gone to prison. I suppose many of the murderers didn't have to serve time? No, a lot of them just went on about their business. That happened right down here at Sneedville. Jim Thompson and me worked on the railroad together for a long time, and he was a good feller until he started drinking. He got into it with his brother-in-law, Hobart Scanlon. Well, Jim got to drinking one day, and he went down to where Hobart run a store to kill him. He hollered out to Hobart, "Come out here, this is where you're gonna die." Hobart just reached down under the counter and pulled out a pistol and shot Jim, and he fell out the door backward, dead. There was never a thing done about it, and them Thompsons quieted down after that. Did you ever hear of the infamous Green-Jones feud that took place over here on War Creek? I've heard a lot of talk, but I never learned too much about it. There was a war over here at Mulberry Gap that went on for years between the Collins and the Brewers. Somebody would get bushwhacked over there every little bit. Old Caney Collins had two boys, Ardell and Pettibone. One of the Brewer boys was out to get them, and Caney knowed it, and he waylaid and killed the Brewer boy first. I knowed Caney well. Well, them two boys, Ardell and Pettibone, went and confessed to the murder to protect their daddy, and they got sent to the penitentiary for life. Pettibone died there. Caney lived to be awful old, and just before he died, he owned up to the killing, and they give Ardell a pardon. I've studied a heap about that. Alex, once you and I were going down the road over here on Fox Branch, you showed me where you saw a man killed. Do you remember that? That was Nat Fletcher, the one who got killed. Him and two brothers got into it over a cow that had got out. Nat shot one of the brothers in the hip, and he shot Nat, and Nat was begging for mercy. Oh, I never heard such begging in all my life. I was up the road a ways and no way to help. They all had guns. About the time the brother walked up and shot Nat again in the chest, and that killed him. He walked over to a paling fence and jerked a paling off and struck Nat in the head with it 2 or 3 times after he had shot him down. Oh, it was awful how that poor man begged, but they sure put him out of business. They sent them two brothers to the penitentiary, but they got a pardon in a few years. I forgot who the governor was who gave them that pardon. On one of my more recent visits, I found Alex sitting on his front porch, swatting flies, whittling occasionally, but mostly just looking out on the crops down on Panther Creek. I told him that I had a lot of questions and that I would pay him 10 cents for every correct answer. He laughed heartily and said, "Well, I'll make some money today." Then I said, "But I'll decide whether or not the answers are right." "Oh," he said in response, as quick and jovial as his first, "in that case, I'll just keep my mouth shut." The questions I had in mind were those which had occurred to me at various times as I traveled through the mountains or as I pondered the mystery of some aspect of early Appalachian life. They followed no central theme except that they were related in one way or another to the pioneer lifestyle with which Alex was so familiar. "Alex, I know the early pioneers had to have saltpeter to make gunpowder and for other purposes. John Salins, who lived up the river a few miles, told me that he dug saltpeter in a cave during the Civil War. According to the Guinness Book of World Records, Salins was the last survivor of the Civil War and the oldest person in the world when he died at the age of 113. Did you ever hear of any saltpeter being found around here? Yeah, we had a place right near home where we'd get it, right back from where we lived. I'd say 500 yards. There was a big cliff on the north side of the ridge. It was just straight up and down like a wall, and it was from 50 to 75 feet high. In a right cold winter, everything would freeze up, and when it thawed, out that saltpeter would ooze from the cracks in the rock. It would be right white, looked like regular salt. After a while, the water would dry up, evaporate, and what you had left was saltpeter. You could go there and scrape it up. What were some of the uses of saltpeter? They used it as sight in the army. They'd put it in everything they eat, kept the men from being so mean and running around after the women. Is that right? That's right. Yes, sir. Swallow it a few times a day and you'll stay at home. You won't be wanting to run about. If you don't believe me, you try it. I'll take your word for it. It tastes sour, just as sour as vinegar. It's pretty good to clear up your throat and your lungs. Limestone rock now is the only thing that will produce saltpeter. It's interesting that Alex would point out that limestone is necessary for the formation of saltpeter. He was not surprisingly right. The chemists call saltpeter potassium nitrate, and they confirm that it is formed in limestone caves during the decaying process of plants and animals. When Alex finished his comments on saltpeter, he complained about the faulty matches he was using in an attempt to light his pipe. Interestingly, one of the primary uses of saltpeter today is the production of matches. The first two he tried wouldn't strike at all. The third one flashed up vigorously but died completely before he could light his pipe. He became perturbed and started searching his pockets for another. As he did so, he said, "I wish the man that made these matches had them stuffed up his tail, them every one on fire." He finally got his pipe lit and puffed contentedly. It was a hot, lazy summer afternoon, and we both were happy just to sit and watch his one-eyed cat groom her kitten. Moments before, she had been curled in Alex's lap, but the stifling pipe smoke was too much for her. Alex studied the cat, and I knew he was pondering something interesting about her. "I feed that cat all the time, and the more I feed her, the poorer she gets. I reckon she gets out here and catches lizards. Eating lizards is what makes them poor, you know." "Yeah, I always heard that." Alex sat there looking at the cat and chuckled to himself. I didn't ask him what was so amusing. I knew he was about to tell me. "Lizards, law, at the time I went lizard hunting when I was a boy. I'd take some long grass and make me a lasso, and I'd go out to an old rail fence and I'd slip up on them and lasso 'em. Sometimes I'd catch a string of them as long as my arm. I didn't have sense enough to know what I was doing, killing them lizards like that. They're the best insect catchers they are, but of course I wasn't thinking about anything like that then. I was up here on the south side of the mountain one day squirrel hunting. I sat down and leaned back against a big hollow tree to wait for a squirrel. All of a sudden I heard dirt and rotten wood falling down inside that tree. I looked around, and here come a lizard out of there, and I bet he was 2 feet long. His head was plum red, and he was as big around as my arm. He come right toward me, licking his tongue out, and I shot and killed it. I never seed nary a one like it before or since. I was telling people about it, and there was an old man by the name of Frost, and he said it was a centipede. Said he'd seen 2 or 3 and that they was as poison as rattlesnakes. You mentioned rattlesnakes, Alex. Was there many rattlesnakes and copperheads on the ridge when you were growing up? Oh yeah, they was plenty of them. Now they was a lot more copperheads than rattlesnakes. This is the first year that I haven't killed at least one copperhead. I was working up there on the ridge one day in the cornfield, and I kept hearing my dog barking down on the lower side. There was several rock piles there, and I figured he had a young rabbit in one of them, so I didn't bother to go to him. Well, he barked and barked, and when I started home for dinner, I come down by there, and I could hear that rattlesnake a-singing. I prized a big rock off of him, and when I did, he reared back like he's going to strike. When he done that, I got him in the head with a stick. Margie never had seen a rattlesnake, and I said, I'll take him to the house and let her see it. Well, I went out there and skinned me some bark and made me a little loop and put it around his neck and carried it to the house. I laid it down in the yard, and while we were standing there looking at it, it come to and struck me right there on the breeches leg. As luck would have it, it didn't bite through my overalls, but I'll tell you, I come might near getting rattlesnake bit. A rattlesnake ain't so ill-tempered as a copperhead. If you don't disturb a rattlesnake too much, he ain't nigh as apt to bite you as a copperhead. Now that dog I was telling you about, he got so he could kill every copperhead he found, and he never did get bit. He'd grab them right in the middle and shake them so fast they didn't know what was going on. He never give them a chance to bite. Did the snakes ever get in your house? A great big old rat had got down in my basement and was eating up my taters. I set me a steel trap in his road where he went in and out, and I sort of covered it over with leaves, trash and stuff. I went down there one morning to get some taters, and there was one of the biggest copperheads that ever I seen. I had catched him right in the middle as he crawled over the pan of the trap. He was as long as this here walking stick and as big as my arm. He was just a wiggling and a fighting like everything, trying to get away. If it had bit a feller, he wouldn't have knowed what ailed him. It is a well-known fact in the mountains that black snakes and chicken snakes would swallow bird eggs and later burst them by wrapping themselves tightly around a tree or post. These snakes often raid hen's nests. I vividly remember finding a hen's nest so high up on the side of our straw stack that I could barely reach it. I climbed as high as was possible for an 8-year-old boy, then thrust my hand into the nest, which was a couple of feet above my head. Instead of feeling a nest of eggs as I had expected, I grabbed a handful of chicken snake. Until this day, I never reach into a hen's nest without first making sure of its contents. It was customary to gather eggs every day in the late afternoon. In rural Appalachia, the hens made their nest in the fence corners, under floors, and in whatever concealed area they could find. Finding the nest was most often the task assigned to the youngsters. Once a nest was found, it was hoped the hens or hen would continue to use it for a long period of time. But if all the eggs were removed, then the hens may become intuitively disillusioned and seek another hiding place in which to lay their daily eggs. In order to prevent this from happening, people would leave 1 or 2 eggs in the nest. Eggs were very valuable, and leaving them overnight subjected them to the danger of dogs, snakes, and other. Hence, the ideal of the nest egg was introduced. The egg was marked so that it could be readily identified and left in the nest permanently. Frequently, an artificial egg was made and used as the nest egg. In later years, glass eggs were used and were almost certain to fool the old hen. Before the advent of the glass egg, wooden eggs painted white were used. Perhaps the most popular nest egg in early Appalachia was the egg gourd, which grew to a size and shape remarkably similar to that of an egg. If this little gourd, which most people grew, would fool a hen, it is only reasonable to assume that it would likewise fool a chicken snake. And herein lies the tale. Alex recalled vividly the snake that swallowed a gourd nest egg. I was sitting on the porch of my house up here on the ridge with George Ball, the feller I told you about a little while ago that killed his nephew. We looked and saw a big black snake crawling from under the floor into the yard. George said, "It's swallowed something, ain't it?" I said, "Yeah, he must have swallowed a goose egg. It looked bigger than a hen egg." I just walked out there and picked that black snake up by the tail, held it up, and I swear it had a place in its belly wore out. It swallowed one of them gourd nest eggs, and it just couldn't bust it. It wore a hole plumb out in his belly where that gourd had him swelled up, and you could see that gourd sticking out. I let him go, but I don't know if he ever got over swallowing that gourd. I never killed a black snake. They kill the rats and mice around your barn and corn crib, and they'll keep the copperheads killed out. Is it really true that black snakes kill poisonous snakes? Yes, sir. I sat right on top of this ridge one day and watched it happen. I was planting corn, and it was awful hot, and I sat down at the end of the field to rest. I heard something right down below me, and I looked and seed it was a black snake wrapped around a copperhead. He was trying to choke him to death, and he tried to stay up as close to the copperhead's head as he could so he wouldn't get bit. But he slackened up a little, and that copperhead bit him. Well, that black snake cut loose from the copperhead and run off down in the hollow to eat some kind of grass that took care of that poison. There's a certain kind of grass that kills that poison, and the black snake knowed what kind it was. Then he come right back and lit on that copperhead and killed him. One of your boys got copperhead bit, didn't he? Lloyd got bit. I was working down here for John Miser topping corn, and Lloyd was following along behind me pulling the fodder. He was barefooted, and a copperhead bit him on the foot. He said, "Dad, I'm snake bit." And I turned around and seed a big copperhead and killed it. And oh boy, his foot was hurting him. His foot and leg got to swelling, and it was as big as 2 legs. I grabbed him and run over to John's house, and he was gone. His wife was there, and I said, "Have you got any turpentine? My boy's been copperhead bit." She got me a 10-cent bottle of turpentine, and I turned it upside down on that snake bite, and you could see the poison coming out. I guess if I hadn't used that turpentine, he might have died. Did the snakes bother your livestock very much? I've had some to get bit, but generally they can smell a snake, especially a horse. You can smell a snake when he gets mad. Smells just like a plum granny. But I did have a big pretty mule that got Copperhead built. It bit him under the throat. I went to get him out one Monday morning to go to work, and he was swelled down under here just bigger than a gallon bucket. His nose was a dripping water, and he wouldn't eat nothing. I stood there, felt of him, and said, "You're a dead mule." I started to walk off and leave him, but I walked back and eyed him and picked up my knife and slit a little place where he was swelled out so bad. When I did, I bet you there's over a gallon of stuff come out of that place. I wouldn't have give nothing for him, but I swear that mule got well about the quickest of anything ever I seed. Another fascinating look into the life of Alex Stewart. Lots of drama in this part of the book, from all the killings and the shootings and the surgeries in those days, and then ending on the snakes. Lots of drama in this part of the book. Those parts about those early operations and the early doctrine will really make you thankful for modern medicine. Of course, my whole life I'm thankful when I'm sick that I can get something that helps me feel better, but when I really was thankful for modern medicine the most was when I was pregnant with Corey and Katie. I had one of those pregnancies that from day one everything kind of went wrong, and I was in and out of the hospital the whole time before I had them. I would have lost them if it hadn't been for modern medicine that knew that I was already kind of in trouble as far as going into labor and those kind of things. So it really made me thankful when I was pregnant with them. I do admire the doctors and the local people there, the old Doc Mitchell, and then the local people, Lou Trent, and the other people that he mentioned that could kind of doctor people and help them. That's really admirable, and I wish I had more of those skills. Not that I want to operate on anybody, but just in case of, a time, like in those days, they had to have that knowledge. Somebody had to have it to keep each other alive. It reminds me the part about the man, his uncle that got shot, and his entrails, his bowels coming out, reminded me of a story Pap told me. One time at fodder gathering time, just down the road here, they were all gathered up at a place, and Pap liked those kinds of times when people would come to help, because what that meant was there was always going to be good food. So they'd all been working, gathering fodder this time of the year, and they'd went inside the house to eat, and they'd left the teams hitched outside. Well, they used a lot of oxen in those days, so there was some oxen, and then there was also some mules there. And something spooked one of the oxen, and they had the horns. They'd not been dehorned, and when they began to run, they run into the mules, and somehow one of them just gouged one of the mules, one of Pap's Grandpa Benjamin's mules, and the same thing. I mean, it was really bad how it just tore his side, and some of his insides come out. Of course, they heard the commotion, and they all run outside. And he said his Grandpa Benjamin washed everything off, and then just did like what Alex described, pushed everything back in, and then he sewed up the gash with some seagrass twine that they had. He sewed it up, got a needle, and Pap said the mule got better. It lived and went on to do more work for the family. So that was an amazing story. But those are those kind of things, like I can't stand about thinking about sewing either a horse or a person up. But if you didn't have any other choice, what would you do? There'd have to be somebody that was actually willing to do that. And those kind of descriptions too about some of those sicknesses and surgeries that people was going through really reminds me of the human body, and I guess animals too, but especially humans. We have such a great will to live. A lot of times your body, there's sad situations where you kind of wish somebody that's really, really sick, and they're not going to completely get better. Maybe they're already kind of in a coma or something. Their body has an amazing desire to live. That's always a fascinating thing to think about. I like one of the words that Alex used in that little part when he was talking about the people getting shot. And he says that he waylaid him. So waylaid, that's a word that we use. That would be part of the Appalachian language. You'll have to tell me if you're familiar with the word waylaid. And when he was using that word waylaid, part of it I think was when he was talking about the feud between the two families, and the dad knew that the man was going to kill his son, so he waylaid him and he bushwhacked him and he killed him. I don't remember which story he used waylaid in, but anyway, that part. And then the sons was also really interesting to me, because the sons taking credit, like they said it was us, even though it wasn't, and they went to the penitentiary. That goes back to kind of what John Rice was trying to explain about that fierce family loyalty. The culture in Appalachia is family-centered, like he was saying, even today, and there's this fierce loyalty. And I can imagine it would have been even more so in those days when it was they were more isolated and more, totally different, more dependent on each other than we are today. But that's a good example, is those boys taking credit, taking the blame for what their daddy had actually done to try to save their life. I love the part about the lizards too. I've never heard that, though, that if cats that eat lizards are poor. I've never heard that before. You'll have to tell me that, or they get poor. You'll have to tell me if you've heard that. But I do love lizards. We have several of the little skinks and the brown eastern fence lizard around our house. Every time you walk out the door, you can see lizards running. Of course, I love the ones in the creek, the spring lizards. I love them. I used to love to find them as a child. I still love to see them when I'm near the creek today. And I love the thought of Alex lassoing them and trying to catch them, and then that he was kind of sorry that he had killed them. But that's a really interesting part, that he was actually lassoing the little lizards. That part about lassoing the lizards also reminded me of a story dear friend Ken Roper told me about him and his brother. They grew up in the Topton area of my county, and he said that him and one of his brothers, they would fish for lizards. They would actually go and lay over a little foot log that went over the creek, and they'd have their little strings with a hook on it and put something on the end of the hook, and they would put them down in the water, and they would actually fish for lizards. So the lassoing kind of reminds me of that, kind of the similar thing. Now, when talking about the snakes, and when Alex asked or John Rice asked Alex if there'd ever been snakes in his house, and he told the story of catching the snake inadvertently, it reminded me of, there's a book that I have, and I can't think of the name of it at the moment, but I'll put it in the description for you, that's just got a lot of different little stories in it from the Southern Appalachians on a lot of different subjects, real small, real short little stories. But one of them is snaking the beds, that they would snake the beds. They would make sure there was no snakes in their beds. And I was like, oh my goodness, snakes don't really bother me, but I don't want them in my beds. So that would be having to snake your beds. And Matt's told me that if you're a person that has like a deer camp or something like that, like Matt and them do, and a lot of times it's campers, they stay in campers, that after being, you don't hunt in the summer, so you're not there a lot, and then when you go back in the fall of the year, when you're actually going to start deer hunting again, that a lot of times snakes have been in your camper. So yeah, it's a good idea for you to snake your beds. He said him and Papa Tony would always do that. Make sure turn all the covers back, or the sleeping bags or whatever, and make sure no varmints had moved in while they'd been gone for the summer. As far as being bit by snakes, I'm not afraid of them, but I sure don't want to be bit by one, and thank goodness I never have been. Our little dog that we had for so long, Ruby Sue, she was bit by a copperhead one time, and it was on her face, and her face swelled up terrible, and of course I was going to take her to the vet, and as luck would have it, it was like the first our vet that we used was not in, so he's on his message machine, says it was on a weekend, of course, call this other one, call that one, and it was the same thing. So and then finally it was like all the vets were on vacation. But thankfully, I kept following the chain of who to call and found a wonderful person way down in Hiwassee Dam, and I was able to take Ruby to her, and she gave her a shot and give us some medicine, and she was okay. My fear was when her face was swelled so big was that maybe her throat would swell too, but her throat didn't swell. And once she got the shot, and after a couple of days, she was sick, but after a couple of days of taking medicine, she got over it just fine. And I remember when I was a young girl, my Papa Wade, he had a lot of hunting dogs, coon dogs, and sometimes you would see them, and you could tell they'd been bit by a snake. They'd be all swelled up, but most of the time they got over it. So again, the resilience of humans and dogs, I guess, and animals. Amazing story about Alex saving his favorite mule by cutting on it. That's, again, in those days people had to figure out how to take care of themselves. Instead of the way that we do today, like I could keep calling vet after vet after vet until I finally found one who was willing to help. So I'm glad we don't live in those times like that where you had to do that kind of stuff, but yet I do wish that I knew more about it in case there's a time that I ever had to do those things. I guess that's why every little community seemed to have, whether it was a granny woman or like Lou Trent, a man that kind of, just someone that kind of knew a little bit about doctrine and could offer a little bit of aid in whatever situation arose. So I hope you enjoyed this little section today. We've only got maybe 2 more, maybe even 1 more. I don't know if I can stretch it into 2 more weeks with Alex or not, but be sure to drop back by next Friday as we're nearing the end of the book.